Who better to help me unpack these issues than Professor John Blaxland from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University and a Sky favourite. John, welcome.
Thank you, Catherine. Great to be back with you.
Been a tough week in this building, but look, a matter that was very difficult to ignore was, I assume, a Chatham House briefing given by the Deputy Chief of Mission, Wang Xining, at the Ruby restaurant in Dixon last week to coincide with Chinese New Year. And he had a bit to say, as he is prone to do. Walk us through what to you were some of the more disturbing elements of that. It was a rather ominous, threatening speech, I thought.
It was an ominous, threatening speech. And you do have to wonder whether the Chatham House rule applies these days in Canberra.
Yeah.
There's certainly things seem to be bandied around that weren't meant to be in the public space. So my sense is that this speech was meant to be out there, and it was threatening. It was threatening to people who have been critical of China, of the People's Republic of China, and of the Communist Party of China. It's the tone about friends and enemies, and the legacy to the next generation.
Yeah.
It was almost
their children will not
almost
speak of
biblical
them.
in terms of the passing down of a curse.
Yeah, it was like you would be disappeared or erased.
Yeah, it was quite ominous.
I couldn't believe the tone. He's got a tin ear, this bloke. We knew that from his National Press Club speech. But
you know, everybody loves a good set of double standards, and the embassy, the Chinese embassy in Canberra is right up there on the list.
And I note they were offended by the British envoy, of course, talking about freedom of speech on social media, and
that's outrageous.
Rebuked. So
freedom of speech.
Yeah,
fancy that.
And he, of course, gets to say this in Australia, but they're deeply outraged when anyone does the same on their soil.
Well, as I say, you know, it's all well and good him saying that here in Australia, where no one's going to turn off the television station and the network, or we can't reciprocate behind the Great Firewall in China. We can't even have our journalists operate.
It's extraordinary.
Effectively. You can't have Twitter, you can't have Facebook. You have to operate according to the systems that are monitored by the Chinese government, and that give them absolute control. It's getting a little bit hackneyed now, but it is in fact quite Orwellian.
Yeah. Now, look, we'll turn from China, or at least the behaviour of some of its so-called wolf warrior diplomats, to our own posture. And we've done that a couple of times. We've complimented the government in the past about increasing our strike range outside our shores. But there has been controversy about the submarine replacement. And you and I have discussed it both on camera and off. And if we started with a blank sheet of paper, which we can't, probably would have come up with a different solution. But walk our audience through where we got to this week. There were some developments about the submarine, and tell us why the Fantasyland solutions that some are still peddling, that we can just buy an off-the-shelf nuclear submarine, are not viable. As I understand it, we're stuck with this now, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, we are 5 years down the track with this. We've been talking about this for a long time. The wheels spin slowly, and the idea of changing direction to get something else now would set us back even further. We are on a path that there's no question, you know, you can debate till the cows come home whether or not the French option was the best one. It's the one we've chosen. We've had experts on the panel who were behind the decision. Now, there's obviously, in all of these decisions, there's politics. There has to be. We live in a democracy where the people who make the decisions are politicians, and they've got to live with the consequences. That's not unreasonable. And of course, we know that the decision was made when Christopher Pyne was Defence Minister. And of course, we know also that favoured South Australia. But there was other reasons. There were other reasonably compelling reasons for South Australia to win that bid. And for it to be the French design, there are, I think, some pretty strong reasons for it to have won. And there are other designs that were, you know, had strengths as well. I mean, it is interesting that we didn't have the Japanese one come out on top, and that the Swedes were cut out of it entirely.
Indeed.
But look, you know, exactly as you say, you know, we probably, if that's where we wanted to be, that we probably wouldn't start from here. No, but we are where we are, and we have a contract. What strikes me, though, is that there really is still, I think, a prospects for some contestation. And what we saw in the last few weeks is really putting it back to France and saying, look, to Naval, the Naval group, is, look, we really do expect you to come to the table and to play in a way that is competitive and not take for granted that we are going to just back you to the hilt come what may. And
as I understand it, we won that argument to an extent. We got some concessions. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, look, I think we did win some concessions because they did agree that they would agree to the proportion, the 60% local. But essentially, that's not something we can just take for granted as having been a done deal now. This is going to be iterative. There's going to be stage after stage of engagement with Naval Group and requiring an audit. And this is something that's come out as well. They need to actually report back at least annually to the Australian government on progress, on accountability for the money spent, and progress on the technical sides of the project. It's a very complicated project. But it is incredibly important. And this is something, you know, there's a bit of deja vu here, Catherine, because if you remember back with the Collins, you know, people were poo-pooing the whole idea of the Collins because it was plagued with problems and it was the wrong submarine for Australia. And of course, as it's turned out, it's actually a remarkably capable platform of enduring utility that's going to have life for decades yet.
And if we're stuck with, and we are, with the French attack submarine, the fact is we can make some enhancements during the build, can't we? We can improve its weapons systems. We can actually weaponise it with unmanned systems and so on. Take us through that.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, the big area where there's going to be some change. And we know that the propulsion system needs to be worked out. And we know that the technology will be evolving. It is... the weapon systems, the missiles, the torpedoes, the options with unattended underwater sensors and vehicles.
Yeah, they can do a leap. They can leap ahead of the hull, can't they?
Yeah, basically. And we've seen the parallel with the F-35 and the loyal wingman concept. And the idea is that you can have a central node that is then kind of the mothership for a network of other platforms that are unattended, that can go into more dangerous places, that can actually provide you with a bit of a surveillance network around you.
Indeed.
And do some of the stealth beyond the stealth, if you like.
Exactly. So the sensor-shooter link as a whole is better than the actual hull. And I think a lot of people are judging this harshly when in fact probably, you know, the ISR climate is changing faster than we can build this thing.
It is. And the bottom line is, you know, and Jim Mullen touched on this, and he's written a bit about this as well. We have a need for a platform that has a range greater than the demands of other countries. Countries like Korea or Japan or, you know, most of the Europeans who need to operate in and around their own countries don't have their own continent that they need to be able to circumnavigate. So, you know, the argument that made by some people is, oh, well, we don't need our subs to operate in the South China Sea. Well, actually, we need them first to be able to get around Australia. And that's about the same distance as to the South China Sea. And the great thing about being able to operate in the South China Sea is that you can. And it's the fact that you don't necessarily want to use it in a hostile way. The whole point is it's the insurance effect. It's the fact that it can act as a deterrent. And that is a very powerful thing. And when we have an arsenal in Australia that actually has very few platforms that can reach a long way, the significance of the submarine becomes all the more important. And the F-35 is...
That's a conversation for another night.
Indeed.
We'll get you back to talk about the Joint Strike Fighter in due course.